Hey guys, Z here. Do you remember when units could last longer on average? Everything is a blur at this point. Shelf life for units really haven't been as great lately, although I make it sound like this applies to everyone. We do have units that last way longer than the average lifespan, but usually that's because they're really overpowered enough on release to do so. But for a gacha game, or I guess FaZe specifically, that's probably a lot more of an accomplishment than it seems. In FaZe case, they usually try to sell the latest and maybe potentially greatest units and skills several times a month by letting them provide newer and better things. Some units, as a result, just end up aging out because of it. In some cases, they're probably still usable too, but they just don't provide nearly as much anymore. Other times, they release a hard counter to a unit if it turns out they're overpowered like crazy. We've had a lot of examples like that in the past. But despite how long this game has been going on for, there's really been one unit that stood the test of time far longer than anybody else, that being in Bride Catria. Now, she's not remotely good anymore. In fact, she's pretty terrible these days, but Catria definitely lasted far longer than anyone really could have expected her to, and it's weird because I don't think Catria fits the same bill that other top tier units have in the past. A lot of units that were considered absurdly broken at one point in time were usually units that had immense offensive prowess or defensive pressure. Think something like a really hard-hitting nuke or a tank that feels nearly unbeatable, kinda like a Reinhardt, Brave Lynn, Brave Hector, etc. The thing with Bride Catria though is that she was primarily a support unit. She could enter combat, but that wasn't really the big thing you brought her for. She gave out triangle attack and the order status, the former granting player phase brave hits if near two allies with the status, and the latter allowing for more flexible movements. Catria was also the only unit for the longest while that provided this type of support in the game, but to her credit, support tends to last way longer than pure combat units because they're not power crept as fast. Some support also tends to be pretty valuable or locked to one or two units, or both, making them stand the test of time, which in Catria's case was a prevalent factor. Giving out player phase brave hits effectively raised the floor for every single player phase attacker. 1 to 2 extra attacks with easier means of getting specials off and defeating units was really good for anyone struggling against the then latest and greatest tanks. It was also a dominant effect that wasn't as negatively looked upon since it more often benefited units and took away from them as other top tier units have at one point. Not that many people didn't find her frustrating at times, at least when attempting to tank her, because it was a lot harder to do. This was also around the time that the arms race for firepower was going off because a lot of units had to account for the latest and greatest saviors, with Brave Hector being the king of them. Most people really did want her support at the time, even with the units that were functionally really good by themselves because extra warping and brave hits was good for everybody. In a lot of ways, it's kind of similar to how a lot of units rely on the reflex status currently to deal damage, although that might be a can of worms of its own. Many units just couldn't do enough by themselves, so they needed that one bit of support to let them thrive. That's basically what Bride Catria was at the end of the day, to be honest, and because of that, she was just one of those units you always saw in Aether Raids for literally years. Although there was a roadblock for a while because of Elamine, she couldn't really function on half of the defense seasons because of it, but to be honest, that was more of an everyone problem than just her, but she was still perfectly fine on the other season where she did thrive well enough. Anima defenses weren't really that functional regardless, but even so, she persisted because there really wasn't anyone like her for the longest time. We did get Winter Cordelia a year and a half later that was another attempt at Catria, but they surprisingly didn't overlap as much as they could have despite being similarly designed units. Despite both being brave hit support, Cordelia's was in the form of dual strike, which required adjacency instead of being within 2 spaces of 2 units with the status. That simple difference really did separate the two, but not in a way that made Cordelia awful. She thrived way more on an Aether Raids offense setting for Gale Force clearing because of the adjacency requirement, whereas Catria was better for defense. There was overlap here and there since you could basically accomplish the same thing with either or, but some roles were just easier for one of them. Still, it was surprising of them to drop another unit that was already largely hailed as one of the best supports in the game, but it made enough sense later that year when they decided to counter her. Again, one of the last Book 7 banners introduced Ruse 4, which removed both triangle attack and dual strike when hit with the penalty it inflicted. This applied to the rows and columns that the targeted ally and the unit used it in, making it easy to hit most units on a defense team, and this was enough to get her out of the mode entirely, even though the skill was pretty rare for the most part. Usually the introduction of a skill is enough to deter a unit from showing up as often because it's rarely worth the risk. Even if Ruse 4 was pretty expensive to obtain, running her on something like Aether Raids defense meant that if anyone happened to have the skill, the entire team would fall apart. There really was no reason to risk that possibility, even if it was small, and it's not as if there weren't more options for defenses by that point too. Catria, for all intents and purposes, just wasn't worthwhile in Aether Raids by that point, and that's probably where her journey would have ended. if not for summoner duels, her support was still pretty valuable there because Ruse didn't really work that well in that mode. Ruse had to hit a team in cardinal directions, which meant that it was really only designed with Aether Raids in mind. Although, funnily enough, she did get a bit of a resurgence for Aether Raids at the beginning of this year, but I'll get into that in a bit. Summoner duels always has interchangeable maps and layouts that made it so it was incredibly inconsistent, and in some cases really difficult to justify an entire team slot for, since it also required an action to get going. Because of that, Catria was perfectly fine for that time being, but just in that confined space specifically. Somewhere around late book 8, they also dropped what was basically a third Bride Catria in Isthea, which functioned the exact same way, except she gave out Canto support instead of warping. She was, for all intents and purposes, better because you could outsource warping pretty easily by that point, but it really made no difference since it was just slightly stronger Catria. Not getting her wasn't going to make a big difference since the Brave support is what really mattered the most, but it's also around this time where they started really pushing the limits with threat range and firepower that we're seeing the ramifications of now. During that book, we also had Emblem Celica in her ring, which started the whole trend of covering the entire map with one unit. Emblem Lyn was also one of those units, but unlike Celica, she could just stay in the back the entire time, and because of that, she really liked Brave hit support. She was the most absurd nuke we had at that point in time, so just letting her more securely deal with armors was a nice benefit to have. The best option for this was Cordelia, since that only required adjacency, making it a lot more flexible for Aether Raid's offense, but it really didn't matter either way. Just giving out Brave support is what mattered, but it's not like Lyn was struggling that much. It really was Lyn's game for 8 months straight. That being said, Catria and the support in general was already waning in value because a lot of units could function on their own or didn't really need the additional Brave hits or warping, but even if they did, it was completely shut down a few months later after the release of Havoc on the Ancient banner, which negated her support entirely. Havoc dropped a debuff similar to Ruse where it disabled triangle attack and dual strike and all that stuff, and even if you removed the penalty, the bonus would go away after, so there really wasn't any real way for Catria to function at that point. It was also something that happened at the start of the turn, and it could hit basically everybody for free if you had the res stat for it, whereas Ruse, you just had to set it up, so there really was no avoiding it. And it wasn't even a case of one unit having it and it being super rare. They continue to print it for what feels like every single month. It's a really great skill even outside of disabling her support because of the true damage and debuffs it provides. It'll probably get replaced once we get an even stronger B slot, but it's hard to say when that'll even happen. But honestly, even if she were still functioning or Havoc wasn't a thing, I think the game would have just moved past her by this point. A lot of units have a ridiculous amount of threat range and firepower as is, many of which come out of the box functional. There is team synergy stuff that every unit appreciates, but it's a case-by-case basis. Not to mention, we have plenty of other sources for Brave support that are a lot more flexible, even for enemy phase. We have Emblem Erica's ring effect that applies for any melee, and Dual Marissa who could just give it out to any ally that isn't in armor. It's pretty flexible these days, and it's a lot better too. Mobility also really isn't as much of an issue these days. There's just a lot of ways to get units around or in a specific area if you need them to get there. So there's really nothing she would do these days anyway. Catria really was a unit that tried to keep the floor high enough, but now the floor functions even without her. But considering she's a book 5 unit that made it all the way to book 9, that's really impressive, honestly. It's hard to say if we'll ever get another unit that lasts for years, to the point where they're considered among the best units in the game even then. A lot of characters are still usable even after they're no longer the best in their archetype, but we've rarely had it be the case where they're among the best. The only one that may come close to that is Baby Camila, but that's going to be a wait and see thing. As it currently stands, there hasn't really been a lot to deter her, although in some ways she's gone up in value over time, which is really weird to say. Baby Camila really does everything an offensive unit wants to do. In my eyes, she's just the offensive version of Brave Hector, where she continues to adapt through changing metas and additions to the game that would have otherwise made her irrelevant by this point. A lot of her success really does come from her surroundings, because outside of her infinite damage scaling, super warping, inflicting the terrain, built-in pass, and hidden run capabilities, I know it's a lot, but still, a lot of the mechanics in the game allow her to abuse them so much more. Legendary Sakura, arguably being among the best units of 2025, means Camila can always retreat with no problem. Even with effects that prevent her from running away, she could just ignore those. She could get extra range with Uma Lane, which makes her even stronger. Camila has access to Celica Ring, which is good if she can't warp in through the terrain. Especially now with the Corrin Ring being a thing that was meant to act as a way to shut her down, she's gained value from it all because she's the most consistent way to remove her terrain. Her start of turn terrain cancels out Corrin's terrain, making it easier to approach an enemy team, which has been so nice ever since its introduction. I think the ring is good overall, but it could get annoying to fight. Regardless, it always feels like no matter what what they try to do to counter her. She just has a way of adapting, and I've covered this more in another video, so I won't repeat myself too much here. Baby Camila really does have a chance at being one of the longest lasting units ever, which is pretty impressive, especially nowadays where units just age out way faster. However, there's no real way to tell just how long she's going to last for, and considering it hasn't even been a year since her release, it's probably better just to wait and see first. That said, if there's any unit that's getting really close to Catria in this case, it would be Freyr. Freyr is getting close because he's still the only unit in the game that does what he does. He removes every single start of turn penalty on himself and allies within 2 spaces, which is very obviously strong. It was released in response to Elamine at the time, but that's a whole can of worms of its own. It was also 100% reactionary because we haven't had any unit since Freyr that cleanses every start of turn penalty. The most we've had are units that cleanse 2 penalties at most, sometimes having their cleanse be within 3 spaces instead of 2. They've been trying to phase him out though, what with Hother being a cleanser and basically a required defense mythic to not get messed up by the safety fence. In some cases it's been working because roll compression is important, but he's still pretty common. Removing every single starter turn penalty is way too good, and the worst part is that he's up for a remix and refine next year. It's really weird to think about considering he's still really amazing, but maybe they won't give him much of anything. Who knows? What I do know is that he's still putting in the work because they really did not think about the ramifications of it all. There's a good chance he just outlives everyone and ends up being worth using by the time end of service hits. But then again, things tend to escalate each year, so maybe he'll fall off in a week. There's also arguments for a lot of Aether Raid's offense mythics, considering they retain value regardless of time passed. Many of them aren't that great, but the sole contribution of scoring is good enough, especially if they're at max merges. If you have 3 of them maxed out, you'll most likely deploy them no matter what because they'd let you hit rank 1. In that scenario, it makes sense to consider them among the longest lasting units ever. However, at least for the purposes of this video, none of them individually have reached the same level of longevity that other units have. Most of them were just good or pretty usable still for what their role is, but as far as dominance goes, it's a lot more arguable. Bride Catria really was that unit, but maybe there's another unit you think is more deserving of that title. If there is, let me know down below when, yeah, thanks for watching. Okay, bye!
I do!